And I want to ask you, start off, do you have an annual tradition or routine that you do, either you or your family, at the end of June each year?
The end of June each
year? Every
year.
year at the end of June, think about what you do every year at the end of June. I'm totally putting Ann on the spot here. I didn't give her any prep whatsoever.
I'm blanking on that.
Well, I have a recommendation for you.
Okay.
I think that you and your family should every year schedule a trip to your alma mater, to Stanford, because Ann was a former track and field athlete at Stanford. And every year at the end of June at Stanford, for the last 25 years, Stanford has been awarded the Director's Cup. Every year, 25 straight years, the Director's Cup is the all sports award given to the athletic department that has won most cumulative kind of team success. So that's unbelievable, 25 straight years. So you were a part of that. And I think it's one of the most remarkable records in college sports, that the total kind of sport success of your alma mater, which you were a part of. So it's very cool for you to be here. So Ann is a professor here now and a faculty rep at Wisconsin, but she has this great history and perspective of this place that we're going to talk about today, which is Stanford. And I kind of had it in my mind that I've known about how well they've done, but I didn't know why. I just assumed it's this great academic institution and it's located in a beautiful place. I had never been to Stanford until I got to spend some time there doing some research, and what a beautiful, amazing spot. I can only imagine what your experience was like there. So what today's focus is in this kind of ongoing session is on this idea of courageous leadership. And there's one leader in particular I wanted to focus on. His name was Joe Ruetz. And Joe Ruetz was a really interesting guy. He was the former athletic director at Stanford. But before he became the athletic director there, he had kind of a really interesting life. A number of things. So I wrote a short little article you can refer to. But so Joe was an All-American football player. He did a lot of really interesting kind of things as a college athlete. Then he had this annual tradition he liked to have where he would go on a trip. He would go on like an exploration somewhere in the U.S. to one of the most unsettled parts of the country. So he would do these hikes and these climbs and mountains and all throughout the West. He had this one story I wrote about on December the 6th of 1941. If you know your history, you'll think something about that date. December 6th of 1941, he set off on this big hike that he wanted to kind of retrace the trail that the Mormon pioneers had taken in Utah. He had done all these kind of famous hikes, and that was a really famous one. So December 6th, 1941, he took off. And of course, we know what happened the next day, December 7th, 1941 was when the Pearl Harbor happened, and U.S. entered into World War II. He was oblivious to that because he was off on his own hiking in the wilderness. And for the next month or month and a half, he was on his own, unaware that this war was going on in the world around him. But he was not quite prepared for that as he maybe should have, and he went into a blizzard territory. And the short story is he almost died in this hike. He ran out of food and he almost froze to death and he almost starved to death. And just by a big coincidence, he got out of it. So that was one story. I want to share three stories that may seem somewhat unrelated. So that's one. The second one relates to a famous football coach, which some of us have heard of, which is Bill Walsh, who was the 49ers head football coach. Famous for a lot of things, but Bill Walsh was an assistant coach in the NFL for a number of years, and he was expecting to get this head coaching job. He didn't get it. The story lays out why he didn't get it and what happened, but he was kind of down on his luck as a young assistant coach, and didn't get it. He thought he was literally living in a friend's basement, I believe, and thinking he would never coach again after he didn't get this job he wanted. That's the second story. The third story relates to the passage of this Title IX in 1972. Title IX meaning the aspect of the law that granted access to heightened access for women in all kinds of areas, but especially as we're talking about here in athletics, That law passed in 1972. Ann knows way more about it than I did. She's written about this and kind of knows a lot about it. But no one was doing anything about it. So the law was passed in 1972 saying women should have an opportunity in sport, but no universities were doing anything about it. And so that was happening as well. And how some of all these things kind of come together is in Joe Ruetz, this one leader. He followed a long path. He followed a long kind of journey. He ultimately, I'm skipping a whole lot of things that you can read more about, but he became the athletic director at Stanford. Stanford had kind of no real history of doing really well. It was probably a different place from when you were there, and they had won just a few championships, not many at all. It was a place where they were most famous kind of for their band. They're still famous for their band, kind of. They're controversial.
And what they do at Notre Dame in particular.
Oh yeah, they got in trouble for that. So it was basically not a sports powerhouse, the long story short. But well, Joe came into this job, and one of the biggest things he came into was he wanted to help, along with some other people. He found some partners, and he wanted to kind of move along on Title IX and create opportunity for women in sports. But it was not a popular decision. Like there was not many people supporting this. In fact, there was one very famous donor who is still present and very active at Stanford, who said, "I will never give another penny to the program if we start the women's program. I will never give another penny, and I'd quit giving altogether if you do this, because it's going to take away from the men's programs." And Joe found some good partners and kept going and kept working at it. And again, I'm going to skip a lot of things, but ultimately he made some traction. And Stanford kind of was the first program to kind of invest in women's sports. And today, if you skip way ahead, Stanford has the undisputed best women's program in the country. It's won I wrote down, just last year they won volleyball, swimming and diving, water polo, tennis national championships. They've won more women's national champions than any other program. And their whole program has grown. They've won 149 national titles at Stanford since that time when they've come. The other thing that Joe did was he hired Bill Walsh as the head football coach, which was a really controversial thing as well. He hired a guy who was living in his friend's basement, who had been kind of spurned by a lot of people. And when he did that, Joe also said, "I will hire you on a couple of conditions." One of them is, he gave a number of conditions, but one of them is, I want you to give more opportunity to kind of minority coaches in the country. I want you to be proactive in hiring people who aren't getting a chance. And so Bill Walsh went and hired a coach named Dennis Green, Dennis Green became his assistant coach and later became the head coach at Stanford, and ultimately became an NFL coach and became really well known in a lot of areas. And Bill Walsh became a legendary NFL coach. And they actually started what's called the Coaching Diversity Fellowship in the NFL. So a lot of today's NFL coaches, like Mike Tomlin and a lot of others, kind of came up through that program, which is a pretty cool thing. There's a lot more to say about what Joe did and what happened at Stanford during this time. And another key point to make is that Joe was absolutely not the only reason all this stuff happened. That is a place that's so rich and smart, talented, like unbelievable people. If you look over the years, the leaders in Stanford, the athletic directors, the coaches, the great athletes, he was not the only one. But when we talk about this lesson today on what we call courageous leadership, I had a couple of things I'd be interested in hearing your takes on. That we often think about courageous leadership as like happening in these really big, kind of defining, visible public moments that like we think about presidents or famous coaches making these great speeches or like these one defining moments. But Joe's example is one I think of kind of everyday courageous leadership. He was this kind of quiet guy that when you look at like the pantheon of names at Stanford, you often don't see his name. You don't see him as one of the ones who was like the guy who made it happen. But if you do your homework and you dig a little bit, you see that a lot of what was to come might not have been able to happen without his kind of daily courageous decisions. Like he was willing to put his job on the line to do what was right. I spent part of some time out at Stanford in the archives reading about that time when he was working there. And there were these, a lot of newspaper articles about how his job was on the line, he was going to get fired, how no one was supporting him, and really kind of like really strong terms coming out as if he was a big failure for his decisions he was making. But he stuck with it, and he found partners in doing it. I think he didn't, first of all, try to put himself out in the front of everyone, like he was the one who had all the answers. He built a group of people around him who he could think with and lead with. So I admire Joe's lesson of kind of making daily courageous decisions, and I think it's a great model for all of us. I'll say just one more thing, and then I got a couple questions for some of you. I think that this can sound a little bit trite, maybe when we talk about greatness in college sports. Again, we talk about championships, and a lot of you are coaches, and you're here to win championships and to win, and that's undoubtedly what we do. I think that this idea of goodness is often overlooked when we talk about greatness. Like, he made decisions that were rooted in, like, what's right? Is it right that we should create opportunity for people? Is it right that we should give access to coaches? Yes, and ultimately that came together with championships and with good things. So I think you can do it the right way. I think a lot of us coaches and faculty or students, we often think, we hear these bad things that are happening in sport. We can do it the right way, and he was a good model of that. So courageous leadership from Joe, daily courageous leaderships. I think it's a great lesson. I hope that we can all read about him, learn from him a little bit. I'd like to throw a couple questions out. I could maybe see if anyone has an interest in saying. So Joe had a very clear kind of thing that he was trying to do. Like, he was trying to create opportunity for women, trying to create opportunity for coaches of color. What are the kind of daily courage? What are the kind of daily decisions that require courage today? Are they the same decisions, or what have you encountered in your own work, like, that requires courage? What are the types of issues you're facing, or the types of kind of relationships that require courage? That's a kind of a vague question, Ann, but Ann works as a professor, but also leadership in athletics. Do you ever think about the idea of daily courage, or of daily difficult decisions you make, and what guides you through those?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm going to come up blank perhaps on a specific example, but I think your point is well taken, that it's more a collection of what is the right thing to do regardless. I mean, you have to be able to sleep at night is what it comes down to, and you have to feel that your decisions are, regardless of the outcome, they're the right ones. And I think little things all the time come up in that regard. I think I had great mentorship at Stanford, and in fact I learned a lot. I think your point about this isn't someone who is the most visible legend from Stanford, which is pretty remarkable for all of the impact he had on diversity and inclusion at the university. But I think about my coach at Stanford, my cross-country coach, who I still am in touch with, and little decisions along the way. I think you kind of internalize those. I would give one example where my dad had it was right before, so to date myself, it was the Pac-10 championships. I'm not the Pac-12, so I'm old. But we were heading into the Pac-10 championships, and my dad, this was also before when had cell phones, which also dates myself, and I went down to the training room before practice, and the trainer was looking for me because my dad had just gotten here in Madison, I'm from Madison, had gotten taken to the cath lab for a heart catheterization. They thought he was having a heart attack, and my coach, I remember very clearly, and we were I think we were leaving the next day, he said, if you need to go home to Madison, you should do that. And it was one of those things where we had in cross country, you run 7 runners, the top 5 score, and I was in our top 5, and I knew that I would change our outcome if I didn't run, most likely. And that wasn't what he was thinking about. And he gave me the freedom to make that decision. I did not go home to Madison. Everything turned out okay with my dad, but just knowing that in the end, the right thing, I felt like the right thing was going to be done. And I don't think as a 19-year-old or 20-year-old student athlete, you necessarily process that, but I've thought a lot about those moments as in my adult career and kind of hopefully guide most of the decisions I make today.
I sometimes wonder about how the era in which we're living shapes the type of courage we have to have. Like when I similarly, like everyone in this room, participated in college sport, and when I did, it was an era way before like social media, way before everybody had a camera on every phone, and now, so a lot of the things that we did, maybe when we competed or back in Joe's era, were way more like under the radar, and the courage you required was a little different, and that way it was less public. And now we have to make these decisions, like a coach making that kind of decision that yours had to make. The immediate accountability that he might have faced for your team to have lost because he made that decision might have been a lot more severe than it would be today. I have a term that one of our coach Chris, I've heard him use the term bell cows that as leaders, like a bell cow. This is a good for us who live in Wisconsin here, but. I didn't know what a bell cow was, but a bell cow is, like when farmers are trying to keep track of their cows, so they got a whole bunch of cows, that it's hard to know where they all are, but apparently cows have a certain, if any of you are farmers, maybe you could explain this way better than me, but bell cows, like cows tend to follow certain other cows naturally, and so the easiest way for farmers to keep track of the whole herd is to put a bell around the one that the other ones naturally follow. And so Coach Chris has used that, I heard him use that term, like identify the bell cows on the team, someone to follow, like who are people following, and that, rather than saying you have to, be some vocal leader or have someone who gives inspirational speeches, that you have someone that you are drawn to and you see like, I want to follow that person. There's a reason. Like I admire what she does, how she acts. Like she has the characteristics that I admire, that I can learn from. And it's a more authentic. I think it's a really interesting and authentic model to say someone I will follow and someone that we can all look to. I think of Joe. I would say he's one of my bell cows, in that he, like the way he led, the way he treated people, the way he had this courage, was someone that I would want to follow and that I admire. So I want to ask you, any of you, if you have any bell cows and why. Like why, who would be your bell cow, someone you would naturally follow, and what is it about them? Is it just that they've won the championships, or the way they treat people? Do any of you have a bell cow in your life as a leader?
Not from my own personal interaction, but as the Rams and Sean McVay has kind of come onto the scene, and he's 30 years old and he's doing things that no one's ever seen before. And I think the way that he approaches like just his daily, so he comes on the scene and I start reading and listening to podcasts in his background, and he wakes up every day at 4 a.m. and he's a constant learner. And you hear stories about when he first started and he was just a sponge in every single room he was in. So I think trying to look at he's doing something at an age that no one else has ever done. People haven't done that 20 years down the road from where he's at. He's doing things at his age that are remarkable. Okay, so how did he get there? How did he spend the last 10 years? How did he accelerate that timeline? Because I think, from a young person's standpoint, that's how you have to approach things. You can't think like a 50-year-old head coach. You have to think, how am I going to be a 30-year-old head coach?
So he's relatable to you, Kevin, because of his age and
his youth,
ways.
His youth, and I think just the way he attacks things. Like me personally, I can't be Bill Belichick because he's accumulated this knowledge and experience over years and years of failure and growth in different teams. But Sean McVay has a more relatable timeline to me because, I just read an article about this morning. It was 2008. Like 2008 is when he first got started with the Buccaneers, and here's how he ramped it up to be a head coach at 30 in the NFL. Whereas Bill Belichick was coaching long before I was ever born. So it's relatable in two ways, both that I admire his willingness to learn, and then obviously the youth thing is easier to relate to.
Yeah.
They don't also have a bell cow? Somebody you look to?
I would go out on the limb and say, the guy I work for, Mick, You know, I mean, obviously there's a close relationship there between us two Irish guys. He recruited me back in high school. He didn't have to give me a job at Wisconsin. I mean, there was a lot of alumni that wanted to be his assistant as well, and there's been a connection there with us for many, many years, and he's mentored me in many ways, not just in the coaching aspect, but certainly the personal side of it. He's, you know, he knows my wife and he knows my family background, and he's given me the latitude to get married here and in the next few weeks have our first child here, and I owe him a lot of gratitude for that. You know, it's fun to win, obviously, and Wisconsin has been successful in that in all sports, and certainly cross country and track are two that have been successful. But you know, Mick has given me the leeway as well to live a normal life and a happy life. So for me, his career, when you look at winning national titles and winning Big Ten championships, yeah, it's something that when you strip back the personal side of it, it's certainly something you want to do. So being around a guy like that on a daily basis has been nothing but a huge help for me.
Yeah. The idea of leadership is often, I think sometimes we look at what we do as athletes or as coaches, and then we think of all of a sudden leadership is this extra thing you have to do in addition. What I like about the metaphor of the bell cow is that like people are already doing it. Like they're doing it. They're doing what needs to be done, and they're doing it in a good way, and we can learn from them without anything extra necessarily. You can look at Mick on a daily basis and just say, well, look, how does he treat people? How does he design his training schedules, or all of these things, and you can relate to him, or the way you can relate to Coach McVay. So I don't know, I hope one of the lessons I hope that we can draw from this little session is that one, that like leadership in athletics, it doesn't have to be like this heroic, like big moment thing. Of course there are big moments in sports, but it also is this kind of daily search for models that we can each have, and that we can have, like, there's an onus here on the followers, not just the leader. We can each seek out someone, we can each seek models to try to learn from and to follow, and that's a very accessible thing. Like, it's something I try to do regularly, and sometimes I struggle to find who I would want to follow. But Joe's one of my bell cows, and so I hope moving out of this we can think about courageous leadership as a daily practice, and we can each think about a challenge that we can try to think about in our minds today. And as we're thinking about our work that we do, who are our bell cows? Who do we seek to follow? And how will we grow from that? So thank you, and sorry for putting you on the spot, Ann.
No, that's great.
So I'll just say that the Stanford model, in terms of a programmatic bell cow, to me is a pretty appealing one. It's a place that has the highest level, people like Ann and others who are just achieving at the highest levels of their disciplines and professions, but also the highest level of athletics. So I guess you might be a bell cow for me too, Ann. I can learn from that too.
I'm
So.
not worthy.
Yeah. So thank you all. Thanks for coming.